This is lecture number 3 in the Introduction to Exegesis series, and we'll be looking at some wonderful pictures of ancient documents this time, and some things you already saw in the previous lecture will be expanded on, but we'll mostly be looking at the New Testament as opposed to the scrolls on which the Old Testament was copied. So we move here to ancient documents. And the first slide then. So the names of ancient documents come from two different things. One is the materials they were written on, and the other is the handwriting that was used. So it's a little confusing, but we will talk through them here in some detail. This is a timeline for the approximate dates, and of course this could be off by as much as 100 years because we're estimating these sort of things, that different materials were used and different writing styles were used, and that will give these different categories their names. You'll notice that I used a different font here for papyri, vellum, and paper. So the papyrus was the earliest material that was used. And now notice that there's the same font again used for Majuscule, Minuscule, and printing with the printing press. So we're going to start with the papyri. Papyrus is a pithy stemmed plant that was found in Egypt and used in the production of a paper-like writing material that has telltale plant fibers running through it. And we'll go back again to that picture of that papyrus in a second. But you can see here the fibers running both directions. So they would cut these plants open. They would cut down the middle. This looks like it's the fiber on the outside, but it isn't. It's the pithy fiber in the inside. They would shave these really thin and then lay them crossways and pound them. And there was material in the fiber itself that acted like a glue, and the two different directions would stick together. So after doing that, you would end up with something like this. And what we're looking at here is P75, which is as early as the late 3rd century. There are 51 leaves that have survived, with the word we use there is extant. There are 51 extant leaves of about 144 that were there originally. And it contains extensive portions of Luke and John. And what I've shown you here is the end of Luke, where it actually says, this is the end of Luke, and the beginning of John, where it says, this is the beginning of John, and begins reading NRK ein hologos, kai hologos, and so on, as you would find in your Greek New Testament. The papyri are written with a script that is called Majuscule writing, and that's, of course, where things get confusing, because if you remember, we were going to talk about a group called the Majuscules that I've put here, but there is Majuscule writing in the papyri. So they are all written with Majuscule script. That means that they're written in capital letters. And they're also written in scriptio continua. That means they're written without spaces. So if you look here at the text that I've written, what does that say? And some of you would be raising your hand and saying, that says Jesus is now here. But someone else would raise their hand and say, oh, that says Jesus is nowhere. Because if the words are not separated in English, we can't tell where it starts, where a word starts and where it ends. So that actually can create some problems for interpretation of the scripture. Not in very many places, but in a few places. Normally, if we go back to look at our papyrus manuscript again, you'll see the margins are even on both sides. And here you see there's no separation between words, there's little or no punctuation, accenting, or breathing marks. If you know Greek, you'll know what that means. And when the writer would reach the right margin, he or she would break the word off at the margin and finish it on the next line. So words are also often separated in very strange places for us. So this does create some difficulties in figuring out the wording, similar to the problems that you would see in Hebrew, because there's no vowels in Hebrew, and so you'll just see a line of consonants and have to decipher what they mean. Lack of punctuation can also make it hard to be sure about the intention of some sentences. And all of these things are the reason that Greek was originally read out loud, both to help the reader decipher the words as they were going, and because most people were illiterate, so you would have somebody read to you. Reading out loud meant you sound out the words and discover how they're related to each other in the sentence. All right. It wasn't until much later in history that people started reading silently. In fact, there's a story about Augustine that someone saw him in his garden reading a book, and that he was only moving his lips and not saying the words out loud. And they said, "What a great intellect he must have." Just think if they came into any first grade class and saw our first grade students not even moving their lips, but just reading. But of course, we have the great helps of separated words and capital letters and punctuation. Here's an example of scriptio continua in English so that you can see what it would be like. And you could actually stop the slide here and just try reading that without forming the words with your mouth. It's not so easy. Now we move to the majuscules. Let's go back up and remind ourselves the papyri and majuscule writing started at the same time. The papyrus as a material wasn't used much after the 8th century, which would be the 700s. But majuscule writing goes on after that. And in around the 300s, vellum, or actually a better word here is parchment, began to be used. And that is used all the way up until paper becomes popular. So at the beginning, majuscule and vellum together creates what we call the majuscule manuscripts. So these are also written in majuscule and in scriptio continua. This is a picture of Codex Sinaiticus, one of very few copies of the entire Bible that are made in handwritten form. It's from the 4th century. This is the end of Jeremiah, where you can see the word Ieremias there, and the beginning of Lamentations, which is signified right there. It's written, as you notice, in 4 columns on a page. So actually, it looks a lot more like a scroll does, and it could be that there was an attempt there to imitate the scroll. But as I said, these are all written on parchment. Parchment is leather, or it's animal skin, but it's treated in a different way than the leather scrolls were that the Jewish Old Testament is written on. The earliest complete or nearly complete copies of the whole New Testament came at this time, and a few of them are the entire Bible, and they belong to the majuscule grouping. So starting a little later than the papyri, around the year 300 or so, and moving forward. But these have a funny history of how they were named, and I have here a graph of some of the most famous of the majuscule manuscripts. You'll notice that they could be named with a letter, they could be named with a name, they could be named with a number that starts with a 0. And then what I've given you in addition is the century that they belong to and the type of text they contain. And our next lecture will be a lot more about that. So Sinaiticus, which we just saw a picture of, is usually called Aleph in the lists of manuscripts, although some lists would put O1. These names are what we say out loud because textual critics know their names, but we write either these letters or these numbers in order to signify them in a shorthand way. Now, the reason for this confusing naming situation is that scholars didn't realize how many Majuscule manuscripts would be found over time. The earliest discovered ones received names that honored the place where they were found. Sinaiticus was found on Mount Sinai. Or perhaps the Holding Library. And I think, have we got a Holding? Yeah, Claromontanus is at Claremont in California. Or, and Washingtonianus is in Washington, D.C. Or they're named for the person who found them or made them famous. Beza, for example, is named for Theodore Beza, who was the person who discovered and published that manuscript. When an attempt was made to list all the majuscules using a more official designation, the earliest method was to use letters of the alphabet. But we didn't know that we were going to have more than 26 of them. And so once we got out of 26 letters, then we started using some letters twice. So D in the Gospels and Acts is Beza, but D in the rest of the New Testament is Claromontanus. Is that confusing? Yes, indeed it is. Then they started using Greek letters when they ran out of Latin letters. And Tischendorf, who discovered and published Sinaiticus, wanted it to be always listed first. So he gave it a Hebrew letter. It's the only one named with a Hebrew letter. But then we just kept running out of alphabets. And so eventually they started using numbers starting with 0. The most recent Greek New Testaments list just over 300 Majuscule manuscripts. Now, you'll remember that we looked at that timeline and saw that after Majuscule as a handwriting style came Minuscule. And this is a pretty hard break. This happened quite quickly at a period of history. And then, of course, later printing happened, but that overlapped with Minuscule writing. So now we're going back to the Minuscules. They are also written on parchment and at the very end written on paper. And they are written in scriptio continua, but in minuscule script. And I'll say a little more about that in a second. So there came a short period in the 8th century during which Greek handwriting experimented with a compact cursive script, sort of like old-fashioned handwriting, cursive handwriting in English. That didn't last very long. It didn't become popular. But out of the short-lived cursive script developed a professional minuscule script. Notice it's minuscule, not minuscule. Don't confuse those two words. Minuscule just means small. And minuscule script originally consisted of all small letters, no capitals, and they were joined together or not according to fixed rules. A glance at a minuscule manuscript gives the impression that it's no longer in scriptio continua because don't you think you see spaces between words here? And in some cases you do, and you may also see spaces that signify the beginning of a paragraph. However, you're not actually looking at spaces between words. Instead, there were spaces after certain letters that weren't allowed to be combined with other letters. And I created a funny little thing here in English. So this looks like separate words, but it actually says the words are separated, right? And these spaces are not in the between words, but they are just wherever letters are not allowed to be combined with each other. So as time went on, some majuscule or capital letters started to be added back into the text. And then minuscule writing also employed ligatures, and I'll skip ahead to that for a second. Ligatures are the combination of several letters, right? And so as time went on, ligatures began to be developed. But let's go back here for a minute. Minuscule manuscripts, yes, as I said, on parchment, they are the largest group of the New Testament manuscripts, and their numbers do not start with a 0. So they're also numbered, but not with a 0 at the front. So that differentiates them from the Majuscules. So, for example, this is Codex 1, right? The very first one that got a number. And it's a leading member of a group of minuscules called Family 1. It's from the 12th century, but it's actually an important manuscript. You would think, oh, later manuscripts, not as important. We want the earliest ones. Well, this is a leading witness to what's called the Family 1 text, which probably goes back to 3rd century Caesarea. So that makes it an important witness to the text that was available in Caesarea in the 3rd century. There are well over 2,800 minuscule manuscripts, ranging in date from the 9th to even up to the 17th century after the invention of the printing press, but most of them are between the 10th and the 14th century. Now, let me move ahead here and look at, first of all, this. I showed you that this was handwritten minuscule, late, probably 14th or 15th century, what you're looking at here. And interestingly, when they developed the printing press, they imitated this kind of hand, even though it's much more complex and much harder to create the font than the earlier minuscule. So you'll have all these funny little ligatures, is what they're called, combinations of multiple letters that are not in our Greek New Testaments anymore, but back then they were, because they thought they needed to reproduce this appearance, this look of a hand. All right. So when you look at your Greek New Testament, you will find that there are, and I'll show you these when we move to the next lecture, lecture 4, that there are minuscule manuscripts grouped together under the designation bis, or with a Gothic M, which did not succeed in translating here to my PowerPoint slide, but you know what Gothic writing looks like. That's because the great majority of these minuscule manuscripts belong to one text type. It's also called the majority text because it represents the majority of ancient manuscripts, most of which are minuscules. So either they'll be called bis for Byzantine in the UBS Bible, which I will talk to you more about soon, or Gothic M in the Nestle Aland, which stands for majority text. So we will be looking at all of that in our next lecture, and I look forward to talking to you about that.